Cool, thank you. I'd like to ask everyone right now to take a moment and silence your phones and devices. And please, no flash photography during the session. Hancock Symposium. Since 2006, the entire Westminster College community of faculty, staff, students, as well as the general public has gathered each year for 2 days to learn about a topic of global importance. In 2013, a gift from David H. Hancock, class of '67, and his wife Linda endowed the symposium, ensuring that all will continue to benefit from this annual event for generations to come. This year's topic is creativity and innovation, imagining our way into the future. Before we welcome our symposium chair and plenary chair speaker to the podium, Westminster Chaplain Kiva Nice-Webb will lead us in a reflection on the significance of today's date.
Thank you, Dean Roebuck. As we begin this year's Hancock Symposium, poised as we are to celebrate exciting and ingenious accomplishments of the human mind and spirit, we find ourselves in a bittersweet moment. Today's date will never again be just a simple date on the calendar. We now live in a world where today's date calls to mind pain and fear of great tragedy. And reflecting on the day reminds us of the particularly horrifying tragedies that are caused not by forces of nature, but by human intention. It calls to mind unnecessary and preventable suffering and despair that are caused by the violence in human hearts. And we are all too aware of the numerous tragedies that pervade our world on the national and global scale, as well as on the interpersonal and individual scale. The weight of these tragedies can be a lot to bear. And today we are keenly aware of the everyday reality of tragedy. Each of us is in some way touched by tragedy, and today's date offers us an occasion to reflect on and honor that fact. And yet, while we honor those who we have lost to tragedy, I encourage each of us to enter fully into the next couple of days, for there is also another side to tragedy. It exposes the resilience and creativity of the human spirit. Let us not forget that even in the midst of the most heinous of tragedies across the street or across the globe, there are always folks willing to help out, to take tremendous risks for the common good, to seek creative solutions to complex problems, and to reach out to one another in new and life-giving ways. So to honor the resilience of the human spirit, let us pay attention to the ways that creativity and innovation make our weary and hurting world a brighter and better place. And it is my hope that each of us finds our own role to play in that wonderful endeavor. Welcome, and thank you.
Good morning. For those of you who don't know who I am, my name is Nate Leonard. I teach in the English department, and I am the chair of the 2018 Hancock Symposium Committee. It is my job to kind of kick off this whole thing with a bit of a talk, and I'm going to start off by thanking a lot of people. So hold on for a second. I'd like to first start off by thanking David Hancock for his generosity. It is his generosity that's endowed this event and allows it to happen. President Lampkin for his support for the event, Dean Roebuck for his support for the event, Dean Cinnamon Brown for all of her assistance with the budget, which was massive, the general faculty whose support is part of the reason that you guys are here today. It's a huge part of the event. Dan Haslag and the plant ops team who helped set up a huge portion of this, Jack Binky and the security team who've done a ton of work on this event, marketing, just everyone in the marketing department who has done incredible work for us, made these amazing logos, all sorts of great stuff. They're fantastic. Sarah Munns and the student ambassadors who make this event run while it's happening. It's incredible what they do. I would like to thank them in great detail. I wish I could spend more time. IT, otherwise this thing wouldn't be on. They've done incredible work. I'd like to specifically thank Michael Cermak for his assistance. He's done a huge amount of work on this event already. The hosts who are hosting all of the different speakers. The committee, who I will thank by name, who is the reason we've chosen these people and how we got them here in the first place. And that's Amanda Gowan, Peng Yu, Sam Goodfellow, Ann Rulo, Danny Crivello, Brooke Ladley, Hannah Hubbard, Emily Perry, who, without Emily Perry, this would not have happened. She is incredible. She deserves a huge round of applause. And last but not least, I'd like to thank Jeremy Strawn, who is the new director of the Churchill Institute for Global Engagement, who's done an amazing job of helping this whole thing come together. Can we get a round of applause for everybody? Because they've done amazing work. All right, so to begin, why creativity? It's a strange question. In fact, I think it's the strangest of that question is part of the reason that we're here talking about creativity today. In the history of Western culture, it has been pretty much normal to accept creativity as generally good, something that is for the common good, and yet we find ourselves here in the 21st century asking questions like, why creativity? So I want to ask a slightly different version of that question. Why do we ask why, right? Why don't we just assume that creativity is important? And I think there are a number of very specific reasons for this. The first is that Western culture, but particularly American culture, has moved to a place where we tend to see creativity as a luxury. It's something that wealthy people get to do. It's people with free time who have the ability to do art or who have the ability to be creative, right? And everyday people don't have time to do that kind of stuff, which is just not true, by the way, but I think we have a tendency to feel that way. Also, we see it as fun as opposed to being practical. We have a tendency to kind of want to engage with the practical in American culture. We want to be productive. We want to make things. We want to, have an economy, right? And we tend to then say, okay, well, this is a fun thing. It's cool and it's nice, but it doesn't really do anything, right? The reality is that creativity is the engine of our economy, but yet we don't see it that way because we have kind of intrinsically gleaned that it's not practical. And I think last, but maybe not least, is that we tend to associate creativity with art. And I mean art very specifically. I don't mean just like any old use of the word art. I'm talking capital A, high art, okay? Which I think a lot of people internalize as sort of snobby or aloof or intellectual and even less practical than other forms of art, right? And so as an example, this is Barnett Newman's Vir Heroicus Sublimis, made circa 1950. This huge canvas is basically red with some stripes. And I understand why a lot of people find this type of art alienating, right? The title of this painting implies that it is a painting of a man who is both heroic and sublime, right? I don't see it. But that's not the point of the painting, right? This is the issue, right? We think that art is supposed to do certain things. It has to have certain jobs. And when an artist is challenging those basic assumptions, we tend to feel uncomfortable. And a painting like this is that kind of painting. This is part of a school of art that is called color field. It happens to be one of my least favorite schools of art. That's why I put it up here, because for me, this is the best example of the type of art that does this. For you, it might be Jackson Pollock, it might be something else, I don't know. But that is part of the challenge, right? I want to put up a different piece of art and talk a little bit about how it should challenge the way we see this type of stuff as alienating. Now, you have seen this kind of art probably close to every day of your life. This is a piece of advertising, right? And what I want to point out to you is that this piece of art has more artists who worked on it than the one you just looked at. Now, just let that thing sink in for a second. That very fancy color-field painting that hangs in the MoMA in New York City, one painter. This, at least one photographer, probably 3, 4, 5, somewhere in there, graphic artists, marketers who laid this whole thing out, not to mention the huge team of designers who developed the actual design of the phone, the way the phone itself looks. What you're seeing in this piece of advertising is insane amounts of creativity. And yet, we look at this, we see this stuff every day. In fact, it saturates our lives to the extent that we don't see the creativity anymore. We ignore it. We're just like, oh, it's just something somebody made. Oh, a company made that. No, a company employed tons of people to make that. And that's part of the reason I say that creativity is such a foundational component of our economy. So let's just talk about the creative economy. I'm not even talking about the way creativity functions within the traditional economy, but let's just talk about the creative economy. The arts, just the arts, constitute 4.2% of the United States GDP. Okay? It's quite a bit. It's about a 24th of the entire economic activity of the United States. That is more than the travel industry, the mining industry, utilities, or agriculture. It's a huge amount of money. And that doesn't include other creative activities that affect the traditional business sector, things like marketing, advertising, product design, research, or education. And trust me, there's a lot of creativity in education. I hate to break it to you guys. You may think we're dull as boards, but we are trying to do something, okay? Nationally, 673,656 businesses are involved in just the creation and distribution of art and employ roughly 3.48 million people. That is roughly 4% of the businesses in the United States. Again, about a 24th of the businesses in our economy. And nonprofit arts, and that's just the nonprofit arts, we're not talking about for-profit, we're just talking about a fairly small subsector of the arts market. Just nonprofit arts generate $102.5 billion in event-related expenditures, which means they generate that money for other businesses. That's the money they make restaurants and people who own parking lots and babysitters and all sorts of other people who are paying to support the cost of someone going to the theater or going to a museum or going to a concert. Okay? Our economy depends massively on the arts. People who study city planning know that the arts are a huge part of what causes what's called gentrification, right? They are the foundation of the revitalization of poor neighborhoods, because artists go into these impoverished neighborhoods and create an environment where people who have more money are willing to spend more money, and that causes people to spend more money. And that helps to create economic renewal in certain parts of cities. Now, it has other problematic impacts, and I'm not saying that it's a positive thing solely, but that is the byproduct of art as much as it is anything else. And the other thing is that creativity is increasingly being seen as a catalyst for innovation itself. So anytime that we invent something, anytime we have a new product on the market, to some degree you can thank art for that creativity. Okay? The General Social Survey of 2012, which is a data set, demonstrated that there was a strong correlation between respondents with careers in science and arts attendance. So people who worked in the sciences tend to go to the arts. Okay, well that seems interesting. Well, this is made even more impressive by the fact that researchers at Michigan State found a significant positive correlation between exposure to the arts as a child and success in careers associated with STEM as an adult. So if you took music lessons as a child, you are more likely to be a scientist or an inventor or an engineer. In fact, this is the director of the Center for Community and Economic Development at Michigan State, Rex Lamore. He says, "The most interesting finding was the importance of sustained participation in visual and performing arts activities. If you started as a young child and continued in your adult years, you were more likely to be an inventor as measured by the number of patents generated, businesses formed, or articles published. And that was something we were surprised to discover." So the more that we push the arts away, the more we start to realize that the creativity that they teach is what makes our economy run. And as Michio Kaku, a famous theoretical physicist and noted futurist, put it, intellectual capital, creativity, products of the mind, those are the jobs that are still going to flourish in the future. So maybe we need to take creativity a little more seriously. Thank you. So as I do this really awkwardly, I'd like to ask David Jones to come up to introduce our plenary speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Nate. Nate thanked lots of people, but I think we also need to thank Nate Leonard for his direction of this year's symposium. When I talk with students in my introductory psychology courses, I regularly bemoan the lack of attention of psychologists to these important topics of creativity and innovation, as well as the lack of encouragement of the development of creativity in our curricula, from elementary schools through higher education. When I look at what are otherwise fine introductory psychology textbooks, I can rarely find more than half a page in these books devoted to the subject of creativity. When I Googled the psychology of creativity this weekend, the top selection from Google was an article from the American Psychological Association Monitor. Sounds good. From 2003, 15 years ago. I mean, come on. As Nate said, as one would think, as creativity and innovation are so important to both our individual development and our development as a species, that this topic would be first and foremost among the minds of researchers in my field of psychology. Not so much. But fortunately, there are such psychologists like Dr. Barbara Kerr, who continue to study and advocate for the creative and the gifted. On a personal note, as someone who was fortunate enough to have been a member of gifted programs in my own education, and as someone who has a 15-year-old gifted son, I can attest to the importance of these programs in fostering educational development and intellectual interest. As I said to my wife about our own son, these kids have special needs and need special education. After receiving her AB in psychology from the University of Missouri, her MA in counseling psychology from Ohio State, and her PhD also in counseling psychology and also from Mizzou, Dr. Barbara Kerr has had a distinguished career as an academic researcher, as a professor, and through her work with local communities to further her interests in the promotion of creativity and gifted education. Dr. Kerr is currently the Williamson Family Distinguished Professor of Counseling Psychology at the University of Kansas, teaching graduate courses in counseling psychology and positive psychology. She has authored or co-authored over 100 publications, largely on her favorite topics of counseling, gifted education, and creativity. And she has won a variety of awards and honors, including the Esther Katz Rosen Award for Research on Gifted Children from the American Psychological Association, the Benjamin Franklin Silver Medal for Education Book from the National Independent Booksellers Association, the Paul Torrance Award for Creativity Research from the National Association for Gifted Children. Today, at the University of Kansas, she directs the Counseling Laboratory for the Exploration of Optimal States, which identifies and guides creative adolescents. Please join me in a warm Westminster welcome for our opening plenary speaker, Dr. Barbara Kerr.
I want to thank my hosts who've done so much to organize this symposium, and I want to thank all of you for being here today, having an interest in the subject that I hold most dear, creativity. I suppose I should start by telling you that although I'm a distinguished professor, that my first experience of Westminster long ago was not distinguished. It was my date speeding me home from Westminster to my residence hall in Columbia to get me in before curfew. But I have another memory that's much more precious, and that is, as many of you already know, there are a lot of caves near here, right? A lot of nice skinny dipping holes, things like that. Yeah, well, I have a memory of sitting with Westminster students, University of Missouri students, and other young people in a cave in complete darkness. And as we sat there in the darkness, we talked about our hopes and our dreams for the future. And at that time, it seemed as if the whole world lay before us, beautiful and new. And it seemed that we could accomplish anything. There were writers there, and artists, and young musicians, and young scientists, and we all sat and talked about our dreams. And I remember thinking, I want to be creative like these people, and thinking, well, but am I? And I only discovered later that although I would not become a great artist or inventor, that I had a gift, a creative gift for working with creative people, for appreciating them, for gathering them. And as a friend of mine said, she said, well, I guess our talent is that we see them and we know them. And that creativity has been very, very important throughout all of my life. I've had lots of opportunities to study creative people. Early in my career, I was able to work with the Iowa Writers Workshop and to be a therapist for many of the writers, and they needed me. And I was able to participate in an inventor's study. I co-directed a research project that was begun by the inventors themselves, who came to us and said, we want you to find out what makes us tick. And that study took me into the laboratory of Steve Wozniak, the founder of Apple Computers, as you know. And it took me into the laboratory of Calvin McCracken, who invented the jet engine, and who worked upon the heat shields for the, he was one of the inventors of the jet engine, and who worked on the heat shields for all of the Apollo missions. And you may be thinking that this kind of creativity is so extraordinary working for NASA. You know what he also did? He invented that thing that you see in the Quick Trip that rolls weenies and keeps them hot. Yeah, he invented that too. He told me, he said, well, Dr. Kerr, it's all about heat transfer. And then later on at Arizona State University, I studied architects and had a lovely shelter that was begun by Frank Lloyd Wright, that a group of graduate students in psychology and architecture put together a counseling shelter. And there I did research on architects, and then later on among Native American people was able to study what we called spiritual intelligence of the holy people among the Navajo, the Apache, and the Hopi people. So as I've gone along in my career, my ideas about creativity have become much broader. And I'll end by saying that most recently, my quest to understand creativity has taken me and a research team of creativity students to Iceland. I know some of you read the articles on Iceland's innovation, and we went there with one question, And that question was, why is Iceland so creative? Why do they consistently have more patents per capita? Why does 1 out of 8 Icelanders write a book? And why, in general, do they just produce so much design and art and fun? And we got the answers, but it was pretty hard to pull out of them because we would talk to Icelanders and they'd say, well, I don't think we're so creative. We'd say, well, does nature influence your creativity? Oh, everybody says that. We get tired of hearing about volcanoes. Well, by the end of our study, we realized that indeed there were many reasons, including the fact that Icelanders from kindergarten onwards participate in innovation education from the time they're little. Not only do they learn to solve school and community problems using creative thinking, but every Icelander learns to knit and to work with tools and to be able to make things so that the kids make their own playgrounds. Yes, I've seen 8-year-olds with power tools, something you wouldn't see in the United States. So, but one of our answers to why are Icelanders so creative was that they complain all the time. They're never satisfied, and they're so independent that they always think there's more that can be done, and they create a society that supports that. So, I want to talk about the bottled lightning right here at Westminster, the bottled lightning in our communities and in the United States, because I do believe that probably since most of you were born, our country has been in a state of contraction of creativity. That is, less funding going to the arts, less funding going to invention, and much less attention to creativity in the schools. In fact, many of you are graduates of No Child Left Behind schools, where the intense focus upon accountability and upon teaching the lowest common denominator made sure that many of you never had the opportunities that you should have had in arts, music, and the many electives that can enrich our lives. And those who are from less privileged communities really spent most of their time doing reading and math, and the most creative kids among them were bored and getting worried about the future. So how can we change that? What do we need to do? Well, there should be another slide there. Do I need to use this? Let's see. Understanding creative people is important. It's important because you may already be one and not know it. As Nate said, creativity isn't just art. And we understand now that our ideas of creative genius have really narrowed our notions of what creativity is. You can be emotionally creative, and anybody who's ever been to a true healer, a doctor who made you feel that you would be well, was working with somebody with emotional creativity, or a great teacher who made you feel alive in the classroom. That's emotional creativity, something we haven't given much interest in. There are so many forms of creativity that you may not know that you are already a creative person, but have never thought of yourself that way. You may know you're creative, but you don't know what to do about it, because the pathways to creative careers are hidden from you. If you want to become an accountant, the pathway is clear. You get your bachelor's degree in accounting, you may go on and get an MBA, you take the accounting certification, and you go on with life as an accountant. But the pathways toward creative careers are invisible, and so you may not know how to get to where you want to go. How do you become a video game musician? How do you become a neuroscientist of history? How do you combine these disciplines? It's being done, but it's not easy to find your way there. Another reason you should be concerned is that creativity scores on the major tests that are used, the Torrance tests of creative thinking, have for the last 10 years been going down. So much so that Kyung-hee Kim, the author of these studies, calls it a creativity crisis. And what that means is that either young people are not thinking divergently as they did before, or that when they take the tests, they don't feel like they're creative, and so they're not putting the effort into it that they used to before. The thing that my own team discovered and that we just reported to the American Psychological Association is that creative young people have experienced a sudden decline in mental health in the last decade. Now, you probably all know that our society as a whole has a lot of indicators of increased anxiety and depression, and indeed among college students, it seems to be a major issue. But creative young people truly are, to use a cliche, the canaries in the coal mine, because whereas only 10 years ago, the young people that came to my laboratory, the adolescents and young adults in our laboratory, tended to match the profiles of what creative people have always looked like, and I know this is counterintuitive, but creative people have always been fairly well adjusted. You hear about the suicides, and you hear about the ones who lead drunken lives, but actually the vast majority of creative people are very well adjusted until 10 years ago, when we began to notice sudden changes, and I'll be telling you about that report as we go along. In addition, other nations now outperform the United States in innovation, whether we look at patents or writing or even great media work. We are seeing that we're being outstripped, probably because we've ignored our creative people for so long. So just 2 weeks ago, it was announced that my laboratory and my colleague Young Zhao's laboratory had been awarded the status of a center at KU. So we're now the Center for Creativity and Entrepreneurship. And we hope to increase innovation in the United States, first by finding creative people. We want to find creative adolescents before they make their life decisions. We want to guide creative people. And that means helping young people to find the creative pathways, how to get into these unusual and brand new careers, sometimes careers they're inventing. Encouraging and optimizing creative performance. Many people are blocked by anxiety and depression, substance abuse. There are issues that interfere with creativity, although among college students, I'd say the major block to creative work is stupid relationships. But that has yet to be discovered. But we've noticed that a lot of our college students, when they come in, the thing that's blocking them and holding them back is that they're in a relationship that's either dead end or no end. And more about that later. So we work on helping people overcome their blocks to productivity. And finally, we work on gathering, bringing creative people together, bringing them together in creative spaces, not necessarily darkened caves, but that counts too, and bringing together creative people of all different disciplines so that they can interact with one another. This is one that's hard to read, but it's about a way of finding creative people that we pioneered in my laboratory, and that was through the biographical analysis of creative eminence. Now, what we did as a team was read every biography we could get our hands on of creative people in the wide variety of domains that we knew existed. And instead of doing what so many researchers do and look at the characteristics of those people as adults, we decided to find out what were the traits and behaviors of eminent people when they were 16 years old. And 16-year-old creative people don't look very much like productive creative adults. And so we discovered profiles. So we created profiles of what an inventor looked like at 16, a writer, an artist, an architect, an entrepreneur, and a creative healer, what these people were like when they were 16. We had to find the ones who were different. So here's what we've learned about how people who are creative were like when they were young. And I'm talking now about something we call big C creativity. That's people who go on to innovate and to create in such a way that it moves society forward in some way. Later on today, you'll be learning about all the other C's, little c, pro C, but this focus is going to be on big C. And we find that, that young people who became creatively eminent were smart kids. They were not necessarily the 99th percentile, but they were highly intelligent. And instead of getting into intelligence theories, which themselves have been somewhat stigmatized, I will simply give you the phrase that all psychologists agree on now. And that is that intelligence is the ability to catch on, to make sense of things, and to know what to do about it. And what I love about this definition is that it doesn't just mean the kid in the lab who figures out how to do the experiment. It means the little Hispanic girl who's the cultural broker for her community, who learns English in 1 year and does all the banking and taxes for the entire community. I met that little girl. Did she score high on intelligence tests? No. Did she catch on, make sense of things, and know what to do about it? She sure did. She was intelligent. So most of our tests can't capture all the kinds of intelligence, but this phrase captures it, and that's what we look for. They also engage in divergent thinking, which is a particular type of intelligence that I bet a lot of you have learned about, which is being able to generate many ideas, to evaluate those ideas, and to elaborate upon them, to generate ideas that are original and that work. Oops, went backwards. In addition to that high ability, creative people have a personality trait. Again, all psychologists agree on this. There's not much we all agree on, but we all agree on this. They have the personality trait called openness to experience. That means they're curious, they're independent, they're alive to their senses. They're the kind of people who are always noticing color, always noticing smells and tastes. They love variety. They like to try new things. They're selectively conscientious, and that kind of goes along with their openness to experience. Interestingly enough, most creative adolescents and most eminent adults were not conscientious across all of their coursework. They didn't have grit. They weren't persistent and industrious and careful in everything they did. In one thing, the thing they were passionate enough, they gave 100%. So that the young kids who went on to become inventors tended to do very well in science and in shop classes, not so well in their other courses. Those who go on to become musicians often blow off their homework in order to practice their music. So that selective conscientiousness is so important, and that's why I am the enemy of grit research. which I think is just perpetuating this idea that we all need to be obedient and work hard at everything that's given to us, to be task-oriented. I think we need fewer of those people, not more. And I think that if we're going to have grit, it should be only in that area that we are most committed to. We have to learn to prioritize. You can't be excellent at anything if you're trying to be perfect in everything. They have the capacity for flow consciousness states. Now, we all have the capacity for flow, but the extraordinary thing about creative people is how rapidly they enter into the flow state. And we know this because every 10 students we bring through every Friday, we let them see their brain on creativity. We use EEG equipment to allow them to watch their brains as they move from a resting state into a creative visualization, and so that it becomes real for them what flow is. Flow is the consciousness state in which you feel at one with what you're doing, in which you lose track of time. Many of you have probably had a project that you started at 10:30 and said, I'm only gonna give an hour to this project, and then the next thing you knew, it was dawn. Time stands still. And also there's a sense of excitement, almost bliss, when one is in a state of flow and one wants to go back to it over and over again, which explains the phenomenon of the starving artist, because we found that many of our creative people neglected their needs for sleep, for food, for all kinds of bodily functions during the time they were in flow. Intense focus, I've talked about that before, but we find that even by adolescence, creative people are developing their expertise in one domain. They can't get enough of it. And here's where I have to tell a story. My son, Sam, loved video games. He loved everything about them. He wanted to know everything about video games. And we were called in for a parent-teacher conference and told somebody needs to tell Sam that he can't play video games all day the rest of his life. Well, we didn't tell Sam that. Instead, we went home and asked him what he wanted to know, and he said he wanted to understand Japanese culture because he wanted to understand, where did they get the idea for Donkey Kong and for the Mario Brothers? Like, what did that have to do with Japanese design and Japanese ideas? So we got him a lot of books on Japanese culture, and we got him a lot of books on video game development, and he ended up dual majoring in physics and creative writing. And guess what he does today? Well, I'll give you a hint. He plays video games all day. He's the managing editor of IGN. Any of you ever go to IGN to look up, game strategies? And he manages 40 writers who write all the reviews of new games and also write about science, pop culture, and those kinds of things. So he plays video games all day and he writes about it and he has a great time. And I think it's an example of what happens in the school where kids are discouraged from their passion because video games are not okay. It's okay to be interested in science, but not in video games. They're not cool. But I think the idea is that instead of trying to substitute a passion for a kid, that what we need to do is to challenge them to go deeper, go further, to expand their knowledge. If this is what you love, do more of it and find out everything there is to know. They have uneven achievement, as I said before. These are B students, usually not A students, because they simply refuse to give the effort. Now that has great consequences. You can't get into an honors program without a 3.5 grade point average. Half of the students that we see in our laboratory, who we guarantee are creative. Some of them have patents. Many of them have national audiences for their music. They've won major awards in creative writing, but they can't get into an honors program that requires a 3.5 grade point average. They can't get into elite universities that require a high general ACT comprehensive score because they have uneven scores on their ACT. So the fact that they have uneven achievement has consequences for them. And that's why you don't often find in the lives of our most eminent people that they went to the greatest universities, maybe for graduate school, but usually not as undergraduates. They didn't go to, you won't find them often at Harvard and Yale. They had high energy levels, which is great if you don't need much sleep, and they don't need much sleep, and it's great if you feel like you're always on, always focused. It's not so great for the people around you who need to get some sleep, and it's not so great when you tend to run off the rails, when you exhaust yourself. And many of the adults that I work with come to me saying they're depressed when I find out how little they're sleeping, how little sunlight they're getting, how little exercise, how poor their nutrition is. They're not depressed, they're exhausted. And so that's something that we need to take into account, that you can have a high energy level, but you can burn yourself out too if you don't attend to some basics. We found that there were both common traits among all creative people, but also specific traits for domains. I won't go into all of them. I'll just tell you that artists tend to be less conscientious than scientists, that scientists tend to be more introverted, so that inventors and architects tend to be more introverted naturally than performers and leaders who are highly extroverted and more conscientious. We found that healers scored very high in emotional intelligence and agreeableness, and in many of the other domains, emotional intelligence was not part of the makeup. That's another rant that I could go on, is our huge focus on social skills. Everybody tells you, you have to have social skills, you'll be working in groups. Well, I have to tell you this. As a creative person, you don't need to have social skills. You just need to have a partner who does, somebody who can work with you. And all this focus on social skills just means that we're marginalizing those kids who are loners, who are actually very good sometimes at what they do, and we're telling them that it's not okay to spend time alone. Women especially are told that solitude is somehow a failure, that if you're not busy all the time with a social life, that you're failing at being a female. And this one characteristic has set apart women who become eminent from those who don't. Women who become eminent are able to be alone and enjoy it. So I think we need to focus more on solitude and less on social skills. Privilege matters. Talent, creativity, personality traits, motivation cannot be used alone to predict the career pathways of creative people, because privilege is part of the equation. And we don't look at privilege in our laboratory merely in terms of race or socioeconomic status. We even look at physical attractiveness. We look at disability. We look at geographical location. Many creative people are hindered by the fact that they're from the Midwest rather than living in New York or San Francisco, so that there are many ways that people can be more or less privileged. And we know that that's part of the equation, and that the degree to which you lack privilege means the more social capital, that is, the more networks you need, and the more cultural capital, that is, the more exposure that you're going to need to other creative people and to creative places. And so I won't go into this except to say that I think we all know that minorities are underrepresented in creative fields. And I think that you'll see with the Emmys and the Oscars that increasingly in the performing arts, that's beginning to be noticed. But you should also know that there are no protections. There are no legal protections for people in the arts, not just against sexual harassment, but against discrimination. It was only recently, for instance, that they began to put up a curtain in front of a musician who was doing an audition so that you couldn't tell their gender, their race, or their social class, so that they could be judged more objectively. Before that, privilege played a big part in who got chosen for auditions. Gender matters in creative fields. Females are underrepresented in innovation, all the way from patents to gallery shows. One of the saddest things is that female entrepreneurs find far fewer investors. And I'll come across this later, but I'll just tell you that those big fancy incubators you see, the glass buildings with laboratories where you get a free office and laboratory and funding for your work, 92%, I think it is, 92% of the people in those incubators are male. So females are not benefiting from that. And finally, gender relations is the most important factor in reaching eminence, and that's where stupid relationships come in. And that is that women, far more often than men, have their career goals derailed by relationships. And even those who have very good, very happy relationships and partnerships will often follow the social trend to follow the husband or to compromise their career goals because his needs seem more important. I know it's hard to believe it's still happening, but I can tell you that at the highest level of achievement in science and invention, what distinguishes those women who achieve patents from those who do not is marriage, timing of childbirth, and the number of moves that the woman has had to make in her life. So listen up, women, okay? And men, think about that. Dual career couples tend to have dual success. Takes longer, but both people achieve their goals. So they only make up 18% of inventors? They're only 2%, so they're not, 98% of the recipients of incubator support are male. Less than 8% of the paintings in the Museum of Modern Art are women. In fact, I was there with my kids and they had to shut me up because I was saying, oh, this is the men's museum. Can you tell me where the Museum of Modern Women's Art is? And they were going, Mom, none of that here. You're loud. Despite their high presence in writing fields, less than 8% of the best lists and awards are women. And it's so funny, I totally hate those lists of the greatest, the best, because they're always made by guys. And in my field, in psychology, you'll have the list of the greatest cognitive psychologists of all time, and then the great cognitive psychologist always sticks himself in as number 10, to be modest. List making, don't do it. The paradox of the outsider. Those who do make it through the barriers of privilege and gender, who make it through the barriers of an education that is not centered upon the needs of creative kids, if they do make it into innovative and creative careers, what we find is that they still felt like outsiders. They felt like outsiders throughout their lives, and even as adults, what we've learned about social networks of innovators is that those who innovate the most, the people who create the most patents, the people who create the most art, the most writing, are those people who are at the very edge of one social network and overlapping the edge of another social network. So if you're at the edge of the social network of biologists, and the edge of the social network in biomechanics, you may be an inventor or mechanics in biology, because you can then combine those disciplines and not get caught up in the politics of those in the center of the field. So it helps to be outsiders. So the paradox is that it feels awful while you're young to be an outsider, but by the time you're an adult, there's real benefits to it. Thank you. So our strategy is to look for the outsiders, the ones that may have never been labeled gifted, the ones that are the girls who are less agreeable and less sociable. In fact, we find that many women who go on to achieve eminence are quite disagreeable, and that's okay. And boys who are less conforming to expectations, they don't always conform to masculine role expectations. Now, that doesn't mean they don't do masculine things. In fact, what we find is a lot of athletes who go on to become extremely creative entrepreneurs are usually those who had a real people-oriented side. And in fact, we often find that those athletes who were the most nurturing go on to become some of the best coaches and teachers. So non-conforming in that way is good. Young people with low privilege but high expectations, we look for those people. And what do we do with them? Okay, then the last thing I want to say about them is that there has been a sudden decline in extraversion. We've tested 1,000 kids, and when we look at the young people from 2014 on, there's been a tremendous drop in extraversion among our students and much more of a tendency toward introversion. There's been an increase in anxiety that not only tracks the increases in anxiety among teens in general, but that shoots above it. An increase in depression, an increase in angry hostility. And actually, we kind of enjoy them when they come into the lab. I always say to the counselors, okay, the first thing you say to them is, you're going to disagree with everything I say. And the kid goes, yeah, that's what I do. Yeah, that's cool, you're fine here. And a decrease in hope for the future. So what do we need to do? We need to help them to find those invisible pathways. And that goes for everybody here. We need to really help people to build those networks that will help them find the way through the maze. I've already talked about this. You may want a creative life, but fear the consequences. You may not know how to get there. You may want to invent a career. And you may have been so frustrated with school, so bored and so worried about the future that you've put off making any decisions at all. Of course, we do recommend individual counseling with therapists and career coaches who know something about creative people. That's why we have our lab, and that's why we have a big online presence in counseling creative people. And we think it's important to do assessments, and we do interest, personality, values, absorption, creative accomplishments, goals, dreams, hopes, fears about the future. We test all these things and show people how they compare to other people. Sometimes it takes a test, at least the state-of-the-art test that we like to use, to show you how different you are from other people. We analyze their flow, what their source of their flow is, and we give them feedback about their flow and show how they can create a perfect future day using that flow. We help them to create a personal map of the future. More on this as we go along. And I'll skip by this by saying, I've already said this, but I'll tell you that we're working on developing creative therapies for creative mental health. Here's our flow discussion. That's all the kids sitting around the makerspace talking about their futures. This is brain hacking, and this is where we hook up everybody to an EEG and put them into first a state of concentration by asking them square roots and capitals of cities, then move them into a state of relaxation, and then have them visualize themselves doing that creative activity in which they feel the greatest sense of timelessness and bliss and utter oneness with what they're doing. And our pathfinding works. 5 years after participating in our workshop, our students are in creative careers. I wish I could tell you all the things that they're doing. They are at NASA. On the other hand, one of our students is now the head of a major burlesque troupe. That's an old-timey vaudeville gymnastics and circus act that she takes around the country. One is translating Russian literature in St. Petersburg. They increase their exploration engagement, and they increase their intuition-based career exploration, meaning they began to rely more upon their intuition, what their intuition told them they needed to do for their lives and not what everybody around them was telling them to do. We provide counseling. We do mindful art therapy, mindful music, and mindful music therapy. And all of my doctoral students are dancers, artists, writers. And finally, we gather them together. The creative life can be lonely. That's actually a picture of my office during my sabbatical. It was lonely. It snowed the whole time. But it can be lonely. And our research has identified a major need for artists and inventors to have a place to work and a way to create a business. And so we explored makerspaces as those kinds of places, and a group of us created a makerspace that's now been going since 2013, completely in the black, with no external funding at all, just on $20 a month fees from people to use the wood shop, the metal shop, the computer shop, the textile shop, the photo shop. And it's been a tremendous success and has brought together great people. And I'm also now participating in the Nation of Makers, had the opportunity to go to the White House during the Obama administration and meet with other coordinators of makerspaces. And together what we're doing, the Nation of Makers, is trying to coordinate maker fairs in every state and to make sure that every kid and every young person has the opportunity to make things. Makerspaces do make a difference, and our most recent research shows that not only does it increase engagement, but it also increases people's general well-being and health and happiness to be making things. That's our group of volunteers. So what can you do? If during this presentation you thought, a lot of this sounds like me, if it sounds like you can learn more about your own creativity. It means beginning to assess yourself and to see how you compare to other people. It means beginning to learn about trusting your creativity, challenging yourself, learning how far can you challenge yourself in your creative field. You need to find your people. You need to find your people. It takes just one other friend. We found that most creative people do well with one best friend or partner, but you also need a larger group that may not be your best friends, but a group of creative people who accept you and who challenge you and stimulate you. And that means sometimes you have to find your city. You have to go to the city where there are people doing the creative things that you admire and doing them very well and achieving recognition. You just need to go straight there. If you're a writer, get to New York. That's where the publishers are. That's where the agents are. If you're an inventor, get to Silicon Valley. Just get there. So it's more important to find that city. Oh, if you're a musician, go to Nashville, not just for country music, for any music. So there are centers in the United States for different kinds of creativity. Find that city. Find a partner who complements your abilities and your traits. Don't find somebody who's just like you. Find somebody who values what you are, but maybe has the people skills that you don't have, or has the organizational skills that you don't have. Or somebody whose feet are planted on the ground and has a steady mood when your moods are going up and down. And prepare a 10-year map of your future, so that you know what you need to do today, this week, this month, this year, the next year, the next year, the next year, in order to get to your goal of doing the creative work you want to do. Now, what if it sounds like somebody else? What if you've been sitting here and you're going, that's not me, that's not me, that's not me? Well, you can still do something. You can become an advocate, a business partner, a manager, or a mentor. Every creative person needs a manager, I guarantee it. I have always had somebody to get me places on time. And Steve Wozniak would be nobody, and we would not have the Apple without Steve Jobs, the entrepreneur, the one with the social skills. I guarantee you, he was the one with the social skills. You need to think about being that advocate. There are many careers out there for supporting, managing creative people. Identify a creative person in your peer group and support that person in their goals. Often that's somebody that everybody thinks is pretty weird. find that weird person and befriend them. Find that weird person and support them. And in the classroom, let that weird person talk, okay? Hey, that weird person could be employing you or creating the next technology that you want. So let down your shields. Let down that part of you that says, that person is different. And instead, do what Mr. Spock always did. When he met a new culture, he said, I can't do it. He said, I am pleased to see that we are different. Defend the arts, defend the sciences, and defend the teaching profession. Make it possible for teachers to teach outside of the curriculum and make it possible for teachers themselves to be creative. Discover your own flow. We all do have it. And find that creativity within yourself. And so my hope and my dream for all of you is that you find it in yourself and that you find it in others and that you help our society to become a society of innovators. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kerr, for that inspiring lecture. I know that you're like me, and you've begun to contemplate where that bottled lightning might lie that none of us expected in our students, yes, some of our colleagues, and even in ourselves. So thank you very much, Dr. Kerr. For the next part of our morning program, thanks to all of you for joining us here for day one of the 13th Hancock Symposium. For the next part of this morning's program, you have not one but two executive sessions to choose from. Both of them begin in a few minutes at 10:30. Both of them are nearby. One just across Latshaw Plaza in St. Mary's Church. The other just across the street. If you're not familiar with campus, just use the crosswalk and find Coulter Lecture Hall. And I look forward to seeing all of you right back here at 2:45 for plenary number 2 with Sarah Lynch. Thanks, everybody.